Okay, guys, welcome to dot point six. We are looking at eustress and distress, and we're looking at that in relation to the sources of stress, so the things that cause stress. Now, as you watch this explain everything, which I hope will not be longer than 15 minutes, I want you to make sure that you are annotating and filling in those notes that I've given you, okay? So you need to make sure that you're doing that for me. Okay. After we do that, I'm gonna answer some questions that you might have, and then what we're gonna do is we're going to do some application questions together. All right, so let's have a look at the sources of stress. Okay, so stress in Australia seems to be a pretty significant issue, and I'm sure that you know from your personal experience that stress is typically perceived as a negative kind of thing, and it does have a big impact in how we live our life, regardless, I suppose, of what the stressor is. So, in terms of a stress measure, this found that 35% of Australians reported having significant levels of distress, so this is the bad kind of distress, in their lives. 26% of Australians had normal levels of anxiety symptoms, above normal, okay? And I mean, like, if you're having above normal levels of anxiety symptoms, that is not very adaptive, so it's not a good thing to have. 26% of Australians report having moderate to extremely severe levels of depression symptoms. And in 2015, anxiety symptoms were the highest they've been in the last 5 years in this survey. Okay, so what that indicates is that the levels of stress that Australians are experiencing have increased significantly over the last few years, or how they're coping with stress is maybe not as effective as it should be. In terms of the top 5 causes of stress, they are the following. So we have personal finances at 49%, so money, family issues at 45%, personal health at 44%, trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle, 40%, and issues with the health of others close to us, which is 38%. So a lot of this tends to be finance, family, and then our well-being, whether that be physical or mental. And as I'm sure you know, balancing a work or having a work-life balance is actually quite difficult to maintain, particularly when you teach or you engage in VCE. Now, what are the 5 most popular ways of managing stress in Australia over the last 5 years? Now, in my Beret class, we talked a lot about ways that we all manage stress, and it kind of became clear that we don't manage stress super well. So in Australia, the top ways, sorry, I'm making like lines on the PowerPoint and I'm just like reading my notes, so that's what that actually is. So apologies. So the 5 most popular ways of managing stress in Australia are watching TV, 85%, focusing on the positives, 81%, which is actually a really good way to cope with stress. Spending time with friends and family, another really nice way to cope with stress, 81%. Listening to music, 80%, and reading, 75%. So all of those are actually relatively good ways to cope with stress. So maybe think about the way that you guys cope with stress and compare that to most of Australians and see how that changes. Okay, so there are 5 sources of stress that you need to be aware of, and you can see them in this little diagram here. In terms of what you need to know, you need to know what they are, what it is, examples. You need to know how it contributes to stress. You need to know how they are similar and different. And you need to be able to utilize this theory in an application scenario. Okay, so this is what you need to know primarily about these things. What is it? Examples, how it makes us stress, similarities, differences, and application to scenarios. So we have daily pressures, we have life events, we have a culture of stress, which is actually an example of a life event. We have major stresses, And we also have catastrophes, which is another example of a major stress. So we actually have two sources of stress that actually come under the umbrella of other sources of stress. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so let's look at our first one, daily pressures or hassles. So daily pressures are minor troubles or concerns that arise in day-to-day living that act as irritants which annoy us and make us feel upset or angry. Okay, so this is our definition. So some are common while others can be rare. And we can see in this table here that there are some examples, or lots of examples actually, of daily pressures or hassles that can concern children, adolescents, and adults. So when you're a kid, even an adult, having to clean your room is a daily pressure. Wanting to go to bed when you don't want to, or having to go to bed when you don't want to. Being teased at school. So conflicts with girlfriend, boyfriend for adolescents, having your trust betrayed by a friend, not having enough leisure time, gossip. With adults, job security, home maintenance, concerns about money, social obligations. Okay, so all of these things are smaller things that can just upset us in some capacity. Okay, so on a day-to-day basis, daily pressures shouldn't really affect us that much. However, I would term daily pressures as relatively insidious. The reason I say that is this point here. The more hassles we experience, the more symptoms of physical and mental problems we are likely to experience. So what that means is the more that these daily pressures accumulate, the more likely we are to have negative physical and psychological symptoms. So what we found is that if we have an accumulation of daily pressures, then this can lead to physical health problems such as sore throats, headaches, and backaches. We can also have mood disturbances and lowered self-esteem. Now, that can also have a really negative impact on our social relationships. I think the thing to recognize or realize is that while these are not significant on their own, they build up to be a major source of stress. And it's like that phrase that you hear, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Okay, so here's my terrible camel. I don't really know what I'm doing. There's his eye, smiley face. Yeah. Do camels have tails? I'm not sure. Anyway, camels, okay? And so pretty much what we're saying here is like, there could be one daily pressure and that's fine. 2 is fine. 3 is fine. 4 is fine. 5 is fine. 6 is fine. But eventually we'll have enough straws or sticks or, pressures, and that's actually going to break the back of the animal. So it's like you have a really bad day and you have all of these pressures, they build up and they build up and they build up and they build up and they build up. And then there's that one little thing, that one little extra thing. It might not be that bad. It might be that you've come home from a really bad day at school and you open up the fridge and you think, you know what? I really could go for a piece of chocolate cake that I made last night. And your sister's eaten that chocolate cake. And you're like, well, shit. My sister's eaten my chocolate cake. And then you have a breakdown. Okay. So it's kind of like that. Okay. So we say it actually has a cumulative effect. Now, when that actually happens, what can occur is that the accumulation of daily hassles can contribute more to physical and psychological ill health than one single immense life event. So if we have a buildup of all these small annoyances, it can actually lead to worse physiological and psychological ill health than like one big event. Okay, let's look at number 2, our life events. Life events are not necessarily negative, okay? So they can be positive or negative, okay? That's one thing I really want you to think about when we're looking at this little concept here. So a life event is a significant but relatively rare event that requires a number of adjustments in behavior within a short period of time, okay? And I really like thinking about the pictures that I have here. So we have getting married and we have going to jail, okay? Generally, getting married is a pretty positive thing. Generally, going to jail is a pretty bad thing, okay? Now, they are big events. They don't generally happen that much for that individual over their lifespan, but each of these events require a lot of changes in a small space of time, okay? Other examples might be changing schools, having a baby, losing a loved one. It might be moving country, all those kinds of things. Okay. Now, again, the things to remember, not always negative, but it can still provide stress. So we know that getting married or having a baby or starting to date someone that you really, really like is really exciting, okay? But they can also be quite stressful. So like let's just talk about, going on a first date, yeah. I mean, like super exciting. However, there is a lot of stress involved in figuring out like, what you're going to talk about and where you're going to go and how you're going to look and if your hair, is just right, and all that kind of stuff. So don't think that if we have positive life events that they are not going to include stress. It's eustress, but it's still stress, still has the same physiological reaction. The other thing to consider is that life events are stresses that include choices, okay? Daily pressures are things that just happen to us, yeah? So like when your sister eats your last piece of chocolate cake, I mean, like that's just happened to you. You haven't really made that choice, have you? Or if you miss the school bus, you haven't really made that choice. When you get married, I'm hoping you choose that event, okay? When you stab someone in the face and murder them and go to jail, again, you've chosen to do that. So it involves a choice rather than something that's just happening to you, okay? Just to note that I've set out two questions that ask you to differentiate between a life event and a daily pressure, okay? So you might want to think about comparisons for these two concepts. So just really quickly, there is a measure or a scale that measures the impact on your life events on your physical health, I suppose. So this is called the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, so the SRRS, and that was, I suppose, made by people called Holmes and Ray. So what this does is it measures the amount of stress people experience in readjusting to lifestyle change. And so what you can do is you can actually have a go at doing it in your logbook, which is in activity 10. It's quite lengthy, but something you can try. And so what actually happens is you add up all the life events that you've experienced over the past 12 months, and it provides an estimate of stress that a person has experienced. So if someone scores 300 plus in terms of their scale, it means that they're more likely to get stress-related illnesses, okay? Because again, if we have more stress in our lives, the more likely we are to get sick, whether that be psychologically or physiologically. The problem though is that, all scales tend to have criticisms, and the impact of any life event depends on how the individual perceives the stressor, okay? So like, have they perceived the stress to be eustress or distress? The other thing that this scale kind of doesn't really take into consideration is how well do people cope. So if they have good coping mechanisms versus bad coping mechanisms, that can actually also have an impact on their physiological responses as well. So things to consider. This shouldn't really pop up in any kind of exam. I'm pretty sure it's not in the study design, but it's just an FYI. Okay, let's look at number 3, acculturative stress. Now just remember, acculturative stress actually comes under the category of life events, okay? Acculturation is a process that involves the person changing their behaviour to adopt the cultural traits or social patterns of the dominant culture that they have moved to or immigrated to. So therefore, acculturative stress refers to stress that people experience in trying to adapt to a new culture when living in it for a considerable period of time, okay? Now, as I said, it's an example of a major life event. So when I talk about adjusting to a new culture, what I mean is when people move to, let's say, Australia, for example, from Afghanistan, they need to adapt to social customs, politics, social values, education, and language. And all of that together can be particularly overwhelming. Now, the greater the differences between the immigrants' old and new country, the greater the stress or the difficulty. So, for example, if you've moved to Australia from England, then there aren't that many differences in terms of language, social customs, and things like that, politics. It's relatively similar. However, if you're moving to Australia from Afghanistan or any of those places, Iran, Syria, then those differences are quite significant, and so that adjustment can cause quite a lot of stress. So studies have found that belonging to an ethnic minority group significantly increases the risk of developing stress-related physical or mental problems, okay? that negative effect tends to be larger on women, children, the disabled, and low SES groups, so socioeconomic groups. And that's because these people often can't afford to access culturally or linguistically appropriate services. And so when they don't have that money or they can't access those services, they're actually not able to get help for their mental health problems. It also actually issues on the grand scheme of things. A friend of mine, she tutors refugees in English, and she was telling me about a lady who um, couldn't. She had a problem with her job because she couldn't understand the instructions and actually didn't have enough English to actually ask for help. So that it can be pretty stressful for a lot of the time. So the level of the culture of stress is experienced is dependent on the conditions that they previously lived in. And so what they found is that, it can be really negatively stressful because of that assimilation, but it can also alleviate stress as well. So like if you're coming from a war-torn country where your relatives are being like murdered and tortured and stuff, and you're coming to the relative safety of Australia, that is if you're not held hostage in like Nauru or whatever, then that actually can alleviate stress as well. So these are examples of the things that people entering new cultures frequently encounter. So we've got language difficulties, discrimination, lower SES status. Really interesting. So a lot of people that like from Africa and Afghanistan, Iraq, and etc., who come over to Australia, they end up being like taxi drivers and things like that. Whereas when in their home country, they're like doctors and things like that, but their qualifications actually don't come across in Australia. Now, that can be a massive stressor. They can be lonely or homesick. There can be conflicts over preserving old values and adapting to the customs of a new culture. For young people, that's actually pretty significant. And to come into terms with torture or murder of loved ones back home. Now, what they found is that a person that attempts to assimilate more into the new culture or who are welcomed more readily, they experience much less stress than people who obviously experience like isolation and discrimination. All right, so let's look at number 4, a major stress. So this is an event that is extraordinarily stressful or disturbing for almost everybody involved. So being a victim of a crime, terrorism, terminal illness, any kind of catastrophe like a bushfire or like a tsunami and things like that. So major stresses can be one-off. So for example, if you're a victim of like a violent crime, like if you're mugged or you're nearly murdered, or if you're sexually abused, so sexually assaulted, or it could be ongoing. So if you are being sexually assaulted ongoingly, or if you know someone, or if you're going through a terminal illness, that can actually be quite stressful, obviously. It can be direct, so you yourself could be mugged or assaulted, or it can be indirect. So, for example, you may not have witnessed a tsunami, or you may not be involved in a tsunami. However, you can watch all of that footage on the news and things like that, and you can also be just as effective, even if the event didn't actually happen to you. Okay, so major stress is psychologically traumatic. It causes adverse emotional reactions that may prevent proper functioning. So we divide these effects into short-term effects like shock and denial, and long-term effects that include flashbacks, strained relationships, and unpredictable emotions. In terms of short-term effects, those reactions generally subside over a few days or weeks subsequent to the event. Long-term effects may be due to factors such as, or they're impacted, I should say, by factors such as the nature of the traumatic event, the level of support, your life stress that you've previously or currently engaging in, your personality factors, and as well as coping mechanisms. As long as they're not too severe or they don't last for too long, symptoms are normal reactions to trauma. However, a small proportion of people may develop things like depression, PTSD, substance abuse disorders, and things like that. And when that is the case, of course, they need to seek help from a trained professional. Our last one is a catastrophe. A catastrophe is an example of a major stressor. So this comes under that category. So a catastrophe is an unpredictable event that causes widespread damage or suffering for everybody involved. This tends to occur suddenly. So when we think about bushfires or tsunamis or terrorism, they tend to obviously occur suddenly, and that causes a lot of shock. We know that all of those things disrupt whole communities, and we know that people cannot control them even though they might try. They can be natural, so things like bushfires, or they might be attributable to humans, so things like terror attacks. Okay. What's really interesting about catastrophes is they obviously are examples of major stresses, and so of course you will get the same long-term and short-term effects that people who experience major stresses experience. The problem though is that survivors of these catastrophes often experience a range of secondary stresses that compound the stress, and it can actually contribute to mental illness. So that can involve things like relocation as a result of homelessness. So if you've lost your home in a bushfire, loss of employment, financial loss, physical injury, or even lack of access to services. And that can, of course, be incredibly problematic. So that is that for the notes for sources of stress. So not too hard. Just make sure that you know those four criteria. What is it? So the definition, examples, how it contributes to stress, how you can differentiate between the other sources of stress, and how you might apply that to a scenario. So once you have done your notes, we are going to move on and we're going to do some hot questions. All right, thank you for listening.